The doctors had never seen this in a little girl before.
I hadn't had my period. I hadn't developed at all.
Alyssa was having her period at 3 years old.
The doctor didn't give us any explanation of why.
I knew in my heart that the doctor had lied to me.
Next, two medical mysteries that defied the experts. When 16-year-old Jean Nolman undergoes ovarian surgery, she has no idea her case file holds the key to an unimaginable medical cover-up.
I felt betrayed. I was so angry. I had to go see this doctor and confront him. I knew that my life would never be the same.
Then, when Russ and Dawn Hazel find out their little girl is growing too fast, they're forced to face a terrifying reality.
I'm thinking, how does this happen? I wasn't ready to lose Alyssa.
I was petrified.
We look at the doctors for what they can't. If diagnosis is a mystery.
In January 1993, Russ and Dawn Hazel had just settled down in Ontario, Canada, and were focused on one thing: raising their 2-year-old daughter, Kristen.
Family life was wonderful. We spent lots of time together.
Dawn was a stay-at-home mom, and so she was at home with Kristen, and I went to work full-time. I am a police officer with the Town of LaSalle Municipal Police Service, so it was a little hectic at times.
Russ was the most involved father I have ever seen.
We had plans to have 2 kids, maybe 2-3 years apart.
That winter, the Hazels begin trying to conceive, and in February, they're delighted to find out that Dawn is expecting.
I got the phone call from Dawn. She told me that she was pregnant. We were ecstatic.
We couldn't be happier. I had a normal pregnancy. There was no complications. Everything was normal.
Dawn goes into labor on September 29th, 1993. 5 hours later, the Hazels meet their new daughter, Alyssa Marie.
It's a miracle. You see this little bundle of joy come out. She had lots of red hair.
She was absolutely beautiful. She weighed 8 pounds, 10.5 ounces.
In fact, everything about the baby seems perfect, except for one unusual feature.
She had a birthmark, a very faint mark on her right arm. You can barely see it.
We didn't think too much of it.
Within 3 days, they're back home and quickly adapt to life as a family of 4.
Alyssa was a great baby, much like Kristen.
It was actually quite easy with the second child because Kristen kind of took to her, and Kristen was a great big sister, and she liked to play with Alyssa, and she kept Alyssa entertained a lot of the time. She was sleeping through the night probably within 6 to 8 months. She ate well, she was happy all the time, and we were having a great time with her.
Alyssa met all the milestone markers for a child her age.
Then, one sunny June morning, when Alyssa is 20 months old, Dawn makes a shocking discovery.
I went to change her diaper, and there was blood in the diaper. I was petrified. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought something had happened to her. I called Russ into the room.
I had no idea what was going on. Only thing I was thinking about is there's blood coming out of her. We're going to get her to the doctors.
We took her to the local emergency room. They just basically looked her over, and they looked at her private areas.
The doctors told Dawn and I she's bleeding vaginally. I was very shocked. I said, "What do you mean she's bleeding vaginally? Like, how's that happen? Why is that happening?"
And, of course, they were concerned as to why a child that young was bleeding where she was bleeding. They were asking us if we had left her alone with anybody, or if anybody we knew had touched her or done something inappropriate with her.
I got to a point where I said, I can assure you, I've done nothing to this little girl, and my wife has assured you she's done nothing to this little girl, and we got to find out what's going on here. After a while, they did believe me, and they said, we need to do some tests. We need to see inside her. We're going to need to do an ultrasound now.
A pelvic ultrasound is a test that they use to look inside your abdomen and see if there's any abnormalities. The ultrasound showed that Alyssa had a mass on her right ovary. On a child that size, her ovary should have been the size of a pea. The mass that was encasing her ovary was the size of a walnut.
The doctor said, she's bleeding, and it's associated to the ovary, and we don't know what this is.
The doctors thought that she had cancer.
If Alyssa has cancer, I thought that was a death sentence, and I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to lose Alyssa.
They said that the best thing for Alyssa would be to go in and surgically remove the mass.
And they said, we're going to do the surgery, we're going to test it. If it is cancer, there's a good chance that your daughter may have to go through chemo and radiation and the whole 9 yards. We were just shocked, scared. I've never had surgery. Here's my baby, she's 20 months old. She has to have surgery?
We told Alyssa that she was going in to have the surgery. That was the hardest decision that Russ and I had to make, was to allow them to basically cut open our little girl.
The next morning, Alyssa is wheeled into the OR.
The door's open. She goes in, and Don and I are left there as the doors close.
I thought I might never see her again.
Minutes seemed like hours. It just seemed like an extraordinarily long time. Surgery was 2 to 3 hours. I didn't leave that door much at all. I'd pace. I just stayed there until the doctor came out. He told us that he got it all, but he could not salvage the ovary.
After the surgery, the doctor sent the ovary and the mass away to be biopsied.
And they said, we'll let you know the results in a month's time. So we went home with Alyssa. We were really upset that our baby could have cancer. The uncertainty played on our mind.
What if it was life-threatening?
Finally, an agonizing month later, the findings are in.
The mass wasn't malignant. It was a follicular cyst.
A follicular cyst is a large, fluid-filled sac in the ovary. Instead of releasing its egg, the sac keeps growing.
And he said, well, this is extremely unusual, extremely rare, Mr. Hazel. I can't tell you why it happened.
And they said that it would probably never happen again.
It was like a big weight taken off our shoulders.
We enjoyed ourselves. We watched Alyssa grow and heal.
Over the next year, Alyssa thrives, developing new skills every day. But then, one afternoon in the summer of 1996, the unimaginable happens.
We had taken Kristen for swimming lessons at the public pool. It was around lunchtime.
I had taken Alyssa into the bathroom, and we noticed that there was blood on the toilet paper, and there was like a smear of blood in her underwear. And I panicked.
My heart just sank.
I was terrified. I couldn't believe that it was happening again.
Diagnosis is a mystery.
As a child living in rural New York in the 1970s, Jean Nolman was surrounded by her large, happy family.
I had 2 sisters and a brother growing up, and we were all a year apart.
Jean loved being the oldest. She liked to run all the birthday parties, and she organized all the games and usually won all the games.
We did a lot together as kids growing up. We were all very close, and we had a large group of kids around our block, and we played every day during the summer and the winter on the weekends.
Jean was just a typical little girl. She played with dolls and liked to dress up in my wedding dress.
That was pretty exciting for me, to fantasize about my wedding someday. I was always intrigued by the dresses and the wedding parties and the ritual.
And while she's preoccupied with typical childhood fantasies, Jean is also passionate about sports. And despite suffering from occasional bouts of asthma, she's in perfect health. But strangely, Jean shows no sign of entering puberty, even as her 13th birthday comes and goes.
I hadn't had my period. I hadn't developed at all. Every day I would look in the mirror and look and see a lack of breast development. That was kind of shocking for me, to see my sister get her period at 11, and I was 13 years old. It didn't seem fair that she was getting that before I was. My mother would constantly tell me, "Oh, Jean, don't worry, you're a late bloomer." And so I kept on just trying to have some faith that, okay, it's going to come eventually. And so going into high school, I was nervous that I might not fit in. People were making jokes about me being flat-chested or looking like a boy when I was 14. I was getting seriously worried that my body was failing me and I wasn't having that same experience as other girls. Their shapes were changing. Boys were interested in them. Boys weren't interested in me. And I was just all alone with my feelings. And I did a lot of reading, and I particularly enjoyed reading adult love stories. They were a great escape. I fantasized a lot what it would be like for me to have that type of grown-up life and a beautiful female body. I would read about all these voluptuous women, and that sounded wonderful to me, especially because it was something unattainable at that time.
While Jean's mother continues to remind her that it's just a matter of time, to be certain, she sets up an appointment with the family physician.
The pediatrician thought she was delayed in puberty because of her chronic asthma and didn't think it was a problem. We assumed that the pediatrician had prior experience with children with asthma and delayed puberty, and so I took his word.
And he said it wasn't unheard of for girls to get their period at 15, 16, 17. Hearing that, it didn't help, because that wasn't going to make me more popular. That wasn't going to make me look any differently in the mirror.
Over the next 2 years, Jean's body remains essentially the same. In fact, the only way it changes just makes her even more self-conscious.
By the time I was a junior, I was probably about a 5'7". Not only was I getting taller, but then I wasn't developed, so I didn't look very different than my brother at that time. And that was disappointing and upsetting. I think that was kind of like a turning point, you know, where there's got to be something wrong. It made me feel alone in my feelings, in what I was going through.
I was getting concerned there was something wrong.
Just to be safe, Barbara takes Jean in for her first gynecological exam.
I was alone in the room with the doctor, and I didn't know what to expect. And the doctor attempted to put the speculum inside of me. I just sat right up and remember yelling out, "Stop, stop, it's not gonna work, don't do it." Because I was experiencing pain right away.
The doctor is completely baffled. Her vagina appears to be underdeveloped, causing Jean immense pain when he tries to examine her vaginal canal.
He was having difficulty being able to perform a normal type of gynecological examination because my vaginal area was too small at the time. I don't recall this doctor seeing anything like this before. The doctor didn't have any suggestions as to what it could be. He said they were going to have to order very specialized tests that were going to cause me to be hospitalized. I was glad finally, okay, we're going to find out what's going on here. While I was in the hospital, they did some blood work and they collected my urine. They did some x-rays and scans. I had no idea what they were looking for. It seemed like a lifetime waiting for those results.
Finally, 5 days later, the findings come in, and they leave Jean and her family reeling.
The doctor said I wasn't producing any hormones because my ovaries hadn't developed enough, and that's why I didn't go through puberty.
The doctor didn't give us any explanation of why.
Already overwhelmed, the Nolmans are stunned to learn that undeveloped ovaries, like Jean's, usually form cancerous tumors. In fact, the risk is so high, the doctor recommends removing her ovaries.
I was worried, and I was very confused as to what this all meant for me. I knew that my life would never be the same at that point.
If diagnosis is a mystery.
12 months ago, 2-year-old Alyssa Hazel underwent surgery to remove an ovary and the cyst that was growing on it. And when doctors give her a clean bill of health, the Hazels are hopeful the worst is over. But now, a year later, Alyssa is bleeding again, and her parents are terrified that she'll lose her remaining ovary, or even worse, has cancer.
We took Alyssa to the emergency room and said, "Docs, here we are." Started telling them what had happened a year prior.
And they ordered specialized tests.
And the ultrasound revealed that there was another cyst on the left side.
The doctors just decided that they wanted to send us to a specialist to see if they could save the ovary.
The medical team immediately transfers Alyssa to London Health Sciences Center 2 hours away, where endocrinologist Dr. Mo Jenner takes over the case.
Alyssa was a frightened little girl, having been in hospital before and then coming into a strange hospital with strange people around. I did an external examination of the chest and the abdomen and the pelvis.
Dr. Jenner's examination reveals nothing out of the ordinary, but he's struck by Alyssa's height. She's much taller than most girls her age.
Dr. Jenner ordered a bone age to be done on Alyssa. They x-ray your left hand, and there's a chart that you can compare these bones with, and it will tell you pretty close to your exact age just by looking at the bones.
Her bone maturity was compatible more with a 5-year-old rather than a 3-year-old.
Playing a hunch, Dr. Jenner orders several blood tests, including one for estrogen.
Her estrogen levels, female hormone levels in the blood, were elevated.
My reaction when the doctor told us that Alyssa's problems could be hormonal was, "What do you mean?"
Dr. Jenner then told us that she probably had precocious puberty.
I said, "You mean she's having, like, puberty, like a teenager?" And he said, "Yeah, exactly."
Precocious puberty in girls is a condition in which excess estrogen causes the appearance of secondary sex characteristics and menstruation before the age of 8. Its causes vary and are often unknown.
Alyssa was having her period at 3 years old.
We were shocked.
As a result of her estrogen levels, Alyssa is also experiencing what amounts to an adolescent growth spurt, 10 years too soon.
The worst case scenario would be that Alyssa would grow very fast in her early years, so she would end up being extremely tall at a young age. Then her bones would come to a point where they think that they're at the age where they should stop growing, and her growth plates would fuse. And so she could be 4 feet tall, 5 feet tall at age 8 years old, and that would be as much as she grew.
Without any treatment, she would progress. With the secondary sex characteristics, which include breast development and pubic hair development, at the age of 3 or 4.
I'm thinking, how does this happen? There's no reason, no explanation. Where can we get some answers? And then how can we fix her?
To ward off early puberty, Dr. Jenner immediately starts Alyssa on a medication to keep her estrogen levels in check.
The hormone blocker should reduce the number of follicles on the ovary and cause some reduction in size so that the surgical option would not be necessary.
1 month later, Alyssa was scheduled for follow-up ultrasounds, and they showed that the cysts were diminishing. We were overjoyed that she was back to her normal self.
And by the time Halloween rolls around, the Hazels are beginning to feel confident that Alyssa's medical issues are under control.
That day, the kids were getting ready to carve their pumpkins.
Alyssa opened the door, and she just tripped and fell down. She had a little bump just on her, like on her shin, in the tibia area.
We figured she'll be fine. But over the next week, the bump on Alyssa's leg didn't really go away.
She complained that her leg was sore. So we decided we'll take her in and get it x-rayed. The doctor ordered an x-ray, and then he came to us and said, you know, she's got a fracture in her tibia here. And he said her bones are very unusual.
Her bones are not solid. They're very fibrous. When you see them on an x-ray, it's described as ground glass. They're not nice, solid on the inside. They're very fluffy and fuzzy.
He told us the casing of the bone should be like 4 or 5 millimeters thick. He said, but Alyssa's, he said it's like a sheet of paper. It's very thin. The doctors had never seen this in a little girl before, and they were concerned and didn't really know what was going on.
I was terrified.
If diagnosis is a mystery.
At 16 years old, Jean Nolman's body still looks like a boy's, and she hasn't gotten her period yet. Doctors are certain that her ovaries are undeveloped and unable to produce estrogen. Now, they've just dropped another bombshell. The odds of Jean developing cancer are extremely high if her ovaries aren't surgically removed.
I certainly didn't want to have cancer, so I felt very obligated to comply with whatever the doctor said because I didn't want to die.
When we heard the word cancer, we definitely wanted her to have the operation.
The following week, Jean bravely goes to the hospital with her mother. And the next morning, she's wheeled into surgery.
When I woke up, they told me that they removed all of the ovaries. It felt very exciting and promising that all I went through was over.
But while Jean is relieved, she must now face a harsh reality.
I was shocked that I wasn't going to be able to have children. I don't think I processed those feelings.
Of course, I was upset that she wouldn't be able to have children, but that was just a fact of life, and we just dealt with it.
And the very next morning, Jean begins taking estrogen, which will essentially force her body into puberty.
The doctors told me that they were putting me on the highest dosage possible for the rest of my life.
We thought, well, okay, now that problem's taken care of, and she'll mature.
I felt like I had a new lease on life. I would be developing breasts, and my body would change.
2 weeks later, Jean returns home. And it's not long before her body begins to transform.
My breasts were budding. It took about 8 months before my vaginal opening was developed. My waist was more defined because my hips were fuller. I liked the new body because it felt more female. And I felt like nobody was going to question my femininity. Seeing my body change was very exciting. And I was starting to feel like, okay, I'm going to have this normal female experience, and I'm going to have guys pay attention to me and look at me. I let my hair grow really long, and I would wear very tight-fitting clothes because I wanted to show off that my body was different, and I wasn't trying to hide in clothes anymore.
I was happy that the problem was behind her and that she could go forward in life and do whatever she wanted to do.
And in the spring of 1978, when Jean graduates from high school, she feels ready to take on the world.
I enrolled at the University of Arizona, and that was like a dream come true. I felt like that was finally going to be a real fresh start in my life. I was most looking forward to having relationships and dating, and I was looking forward to being sexually active. I went dancing, I went on dates, and it felt really, really good to get that attention. At that point, I thought that the surgery had worked, the hormones had worked, and I was good to go for the rest of my life.
But gradually, over the next 2 years, Jean's hopes of looking like any other girl are dashed.
I continued to grow taller. By the time I was like 20, 21, I got to the height of 6'1". I'd always been very muscular as a child and as a teen, but at 6'1", it brought me unwanted attention. Sometimes I would get mistaken for a guy, and it was a constant reminder there was something wrong and I was different. I didn't have any tall relatives to say, yeah, it could come from here or there. At that point, I decided that I would try to figure out the real truth.
Determined to get some answers, Jean contacts the hospital where her ovaries were removed 5 years ago.
I decided that I needed to get my records, and the response was that I'd never been at the hospital. I was incensed, and that confirmed for me that there is something that they're hiding.
If diagnosis is a mystery.
Dawn and Russ Hazel's daughter, Alyssa, has been diagnosed with a bizarre condition, precocious puberty. At 3 years old, she's already getting her period. And now, new tests have revealed that her bones are frighteningly thin. Baffled, the emergency room doctor refers the Hazels back to Alyssa's physician, Dr. Mo Jenner.
The parents were concerned with this new information.
We told him we had found out that the casing on the bones were really thin, and they're unusual. They're different bones.
And you could almost see a light bulb go off in his head.
Dr. Jenner thinks he knows what's going on, but to confirm his hunch, he reaches out to a fellow specialist.
Dr. Jenner and I were colleagues at Children's Hospital in London, Ontario, in the Division of Pediatric Endocrinology.
Dr. Jenner came back and he said, "Does she have any birthmarks?"
And we kind of looked at each other and thought, well, yeah, she's always had a very faint mark on her right arm.
We're redheads. It's like the color of a freckle, but it's really unusual, but it's not very prominent.
There wasn't much else that it could be, and that was the syndrome that we know of as McCune-Albright syndrome.
McCune-Albright syndrome is an extremely rare genetic disorder. In healthy individuals, genes provide the body with all of the instructions they need to function properly. But in patients like Alyssa, for some unknown reason, a mutated gene triggers early puberty, painful bone deformations, and cafe au lait-colored skin spots.
The gene that's mutated in McCune-Albright syndrome is the GNAS1 gene, but the reason for the mutation is not known. This can have an effect on many systems in the body.
It was a great relief to finally find out that what she had a name.
In fact, the Hazels had seen the very first sign of the syndrome the day Alyssa was born, her birthmark.
The mutated gene can affect skin cells and cause the affected skin cells to appear darker, and this leads to the cafe au lait spots that we see.
Then, over time, the same mutated gene triggered an overproduction of estrogen, stimulating the growth of Alyssa's ovarian cysts, her period, and her growth spurt.
The cysts that Alyssa had in her ovaries related to the high activity of the cells in the ovary that are making estrogen. As these cells work harder and harder, they get larger and larger and form these cysts. These high estrogen levels led to an early growth spurt and early menstruation.
And it also caused Alyssa's bones to develop abnormally, leading to the fracture of her tibia.
Normal bone is going to be composed of harder, more dense bone around the outside. And inside the bone, there's more of a lattice work. It helps with how the bone handles stresses. In patients with McCune-Albright syndrome, this architecture is abnormal. And because of this, the bone becomes more prone to fracture.
And as the disease progresses, differences between the densities of bone can also result in severe impairments.
The worst case scenario with patients with McCune-Albright syndrome is that the bones can be deformed. You'll see it in the bones of the skull.
When it develops in the skull, it sometimes becomes thicker bone, so we run the risk of having difficulties with her eyesight. Her hearing could be affected. Her teeth could be affected too.
We were shocked with the diagnosis. Now, what does this mean? What do we have to look forward to?
While there's no cure for McCune-Albright syndrome, it can be treated. Alyssa should continue to take the hormone blockers to ward off puberty.
When the blocking agents are removed at the normal time of pubertal onset, which would be around 12 or 13, then she could progress and have the normal hormonal fluctuations.
And Russ and Dawn will have to be careful to keep Alyssa out of situations where her uneven bones can easily fracture.
He said there'll be no contact sports, there'll be no ice skating, no rollerblading. You know, anything that can be risky behavior where you're going to fall down, she's got a little trip and fall, she'll break.
Unfortunately, there's a possibility that Alyssa's bone malformations will eventually affect her appearance.
The facial deformities that occur with McCune-Albright cause asymmetry, in other words, an imbalance of features between the right and the left side, and some overgrowth of bone in the base of the skull and in the cheeks.
I was concerned that Alyssa would be different than other kids.
We didn't want her to experience pain. We don't want your kids to experience any pain.
I was so scared.
If diagnosis is a mystery.
When doctors told Jean Nolman that her ovaries never developed, she had them removed. But a bizarre growth spurt at age 21 has left her wondering if the doctors told her the whole truth. And when the hospital at which she had the surgery claims it has absolutely no record of her, Jean flies across the country, determined to get to the bottom of her case.
When I got to the hospital, I told them that I had requested my records, and they said I'd never been there. And I made a big scene. And I said, "You better find my records." And lo and behold, within a few minutes, they located the records and were going to send them to my doctor. It wasn't traditional in the 80s for patients to be able to get their own records, so I had to trust that they were going to actually send the records to my doctor in Arizona. About a month later, my doctor called me and told me that she'd gotten the records. And I knew by the tone of her voice that there was something important in there.
Jean's physician recommends that a specialist take a look at the file and sends it to Dr. Marcel Cedars, a reproductive endocrinologist at the University of California at San Francisco.
I got very limited records that described exactly what they did during the surgery and kind of their indications for surgery.
While her doctors at the time had told Jean that they were removing her undeveloped ovaries, the report says something very different. In fact, as Dr. Cedars can see from the file, Jean never had ovaries.
When she had her surgery, they took her gonads out.
Gonads are structures in a fetus with the potential to turn into either male testes or female ovaries.
I felt very upset that they told me that I'd had an underdeveloped ovary because, in fact, I never had an ovary or a testy. It was neither. And so I knew they made that up. I was just blown away that they would let me live my life not knowing what really had occurred.
Based on their indications of surgery, I can tell that they knew that she had Swyer syndrome.
Swyer syndrome is a very rare genetic condition in which an individual is born with an XY chromosome but develops female reproductive organs except for ovaries. In a healthy fetus, a gene on the Y chromosome switches the gonads on to become testes. The testes then manufacture two key hormones, testosterone, which creates male characteristics, and anti-Müllerian hormone, which suppresses female characteristics. But in patients like Jean, the gene that signals the gonads malfunctions, and they fail to become testes or ovaries. Some female characteristics develop, but without ovaries to make estrogen, the body can't enter puberty.
Jean has an XY chromosome, and traditionally we think of XX as being female and XY as being male. But it's not really having a Y that makes someone male or female. It's particular genes on the Y chromosome. Swyer syndrome is a defect of genes on the Y chromosome, and there is no male development.
When she told me that I had XY chromosomes, I was shocked. This was nothing I had ever heard of. I couldn't have even conceived of it.
In Swyer syndrome, the cells that would normally develop as the testicle don't develop, and you're missing Müllerian inhibiting substance. Müllerian structures are what goes on to develop into the uterus and the fallopian tubes, and so those structures will develop normally. The second thing is there's an absence of testosterone. All of the things that we think of as maleness are driven by testosterone. And if there is no release of either testosterone or Müllerian inhibiting substance, the pathway goes into a normal female developmental pathway.
However, while Swyer patients develop a uterus, vagina, and fallopian tubes, without a second X chromosome, their gonads never become ovaries.
They really are completely normal women, except that there's no production of estrogen, so then there's no onset of puberty.
It made sense that I couldn't go through puberty because I had no estrogen coursing through my body.
Jean's lack of estrogen is also directly related to her height.
Part of the reason that Jean is taller is because she has a Y chromosome, and one of the genes for height is on the Y chromosome. Also, typically growth occurs in puberty. The later you go into puberty, the taller you will be because you've already gained height before the growth spurt. So if she'd gone through a more normal female timing of puberty, then she would have been shorter.
And while broad shoulders like Jean's are common among women with Swyer syndrome, surprisingly, some of her other distinctive characteristics are not.
Jean had some increase in her jaw size. That isn't typical necessarily of Swyer syndrome. I don't think it's typical for women with Swyer syndrome to be more masculine. They don't get masculinized in terms of excessive hair growth. They don't have different muscle mass than a normal female.
Swyer syndrome is one of the more rare disorders of sex development.
I believe it's estimated to be about 3 to 5 per 100,000 births. So it's pretty unusual.
And Dr. Cedars is able to assure Jean that while she was given a false diagnosis 5 years ago, removing the gonads is the standard treatment for Swyers.
People estimate anywhere from 30 to 60% chance that the gonads will have tumor formation. And so the recommendation is once you diagnose a woman with Swyer syndrome, that you go to surgery and take the gonads out.
I was able to accept the diagnosis, but I couldn't accept that the doctors hadn't been truthful with me.
We were very upset about that, the fact that the doctor lied to us.
I think perhaps in the past there was a lot of concern about a patient's ability to accept that diagnosis.
I felt betrayed by the doctors. Why couldn't they have told this to me? I was so angry that I felt I had to go see this doctor and I had to confront him.
If diagnosis is a mystery.
Over the past year, Russ and Dawn Hazel have watched their daughter endure a series of bizarre symptoms, from getting her period at age 3 to strange bone fractures. They finally learned that Alyssa has McCune-Albright syndrome, an incurable genetic condition. Overwhelmed by it all, they can't help but wonder why doctors fail to recognize the disease.
McCune-Albright syndrome is a rare genetic syndrome, less frequent than 1 in 100,000 individuals. Aside from Alyssa, I've seen one other patient with McCune-Albright syndrome.
Now that we know what it is, you can move on and deal with things when they come. She was limited in her physical activities that we would allow her to do. We compromised in other ways, and we protected her as much as we could.
If diagnosis is a mystery.
5 years ago, Jean Nolman's doctor deliberately withheld important information about her health. Now, the 21-year-old is on her way to confront him and find out why he lied to her.
I was livid. And I showed up unannounced because I wanted to make sure that I would catch him. And I said, "How could you have not told me the truth?" And he said, "Oh, I thought I was doing the right thing, and I thought it would affect your identity, and, you know, I just wanted you to be okay." And I let him know that what he did had a very negative impact on my life. That lying to me was far more damaging than hearing the truth. That experience was so cathartic. It really helped me move on to another phase in my life. After I got the diagnosis, I think I finally was able to process some of the emotions that I probably should have experienced at 18 or 19. Finally, I was able to grieve that I couldn't have a child. I felt propelled to open a new chapter of my life.
After graduating from college, Jean begins a career as a social worker and eventually moves to San Francisco, where she finds the man of her dreams.
Bob and I worked together as counselors, and I really respected him more than any man I'd ever met. I really liked him.
I had saw her and was interested in her and asked her out, and then we went out from there.
The first month I was with Bob, I knew that he was really special. I was nervous about telling him about my chromosomal status because I'd never really liked anybody so much as I did with him.
When she told me that she had this condition, I was taken aback a little bit. I didn't understand it. I asked her, "Well, does that mean that you were a male?" And she was like, "No." But the more she talked about it, the more it didn't matter.
After going out for about 2 years, Bob asked me to marry him. It was a fairy tale come true.
She looked gorgeous. She just looked like a vision to me.
I had promised Bob that we would adopt 2 children, and so 3 years after we got married, we adopted my son. A year and a half after we adopted my son, my daughter was born, and we adopted her.
Today, Alyssa is 16 years old. She has experienced puberty like any teenager. And just like any adolescent, she does things that make her parents nervous.
I'm wearing a brace because I was on a roller coaster and I really hurt my neck.
She's a very determined little girl. She's learned to adapt herself to be able to do things that other kids can do. She's well adjusted and she's just happy.
I try to blend in as much as I can at school. It hasn't affected my life that much. I try to act as normal as I can.
While the disease has affected her appearance, Alyssa's case is relatively mild.
Alyssa is experiencing these facial deformities to a somewhat lesser degree than other children with this syndrome.
And the Hazels take heart that her condition hasn't dimmed Alyssa's spirit.
Alyssa is the most positive, upbeat, happy person you're gonna meet. She's always got a smile.
It's an honor to know Alyssa. She's taught me how to deal with things. When I look at her and I see the kind of kid that she's turned out to be, you're so proud. And I hope she gets whatever she wants out of life.
I don't let the disease hold me down. I just try to be positive and just accept it and just go on with life.
Today, Jean is healthy and living her life to the fullest.
I'm amazed that I've managed to marry the man of my dreams, somebody that I'm still in love with, and have 2 children. My son, Kenny, is currently 18 years old, and my daughter, Kiana, just turned 14. They're magnificent children. They make my life very rich.
Gina's doing fabulous. She's just so well balanced. She doesn't let her disorder be a negative. It's made her a better person and has made the whole family better because of it.
I don't know if Jean is who she is because of it or if it's the other way around. But Jean has always been a strong person. I couldn't be prouder of my daughter. She is the greatest.
What I want Swires women to know is that this doesn't have to be the end of your life getting this type of diagnosis. It could be just the beginning and realizing that you become a woman a little differently than others, but that you're just as much a woman as anyone else and that you can have a fantastic life.